So welcome to this Take 30 LGBTQ plus 101, what Open needs to know about LGBTQ oral health. So today's Take 30 will be led by Annalise. The purpose of today's Take 30 is an overview of what LGBTQ plus allies need to know to support equitable oral health. Before she starts, I would like to address a few housekeeping items. This presentation will be recorded and will be later posted on Open's online community at communities.openoralhealth.org. I will also add the link to the chat if you need it. If you aren't familiar with the community, you should go to the link, request a login, and gain access to all of Open's resources, policy alerts, and network-wide updates. I currently have you all muted, and we ask that you please pop any questions that you have into the chat, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end. Once the team is finished with their presentation, you can unmute yourself to ask a question either by clicking on the microphone icon or on your RingCentral window, or by phone pressing *6. We also would like to remind you to please complete a meeting evaluation survey that I will also be adding to the chat shortly. And now I will turn it over to Annalise.
Thanks, Valerie. Hi, everyone. I know that we still have lots of folks joining, which is totally fine. I just wanted to say hi and introduce myself while people are still logging in, and thank you for being here. My name is Annalise Cothran. I'm the Executive Director of the American Institute of Dental Public Health, and I am also the facilitator for the LGBTQIA+ learning collaborative here with Open. And so today I'm going to be giving really a very brief overview. We cannot accomplish the entire spectrum of learning and education around LGBTQIA+ issues or oral health in a 30-minute window, but hopefully what I can present today is some information for you to consider and perhaps activate around throughout the month of June and beyond as we celebrate Pride. So I'm going to share my screen. I do have a few slides, mostly just to help facilitate conversation, but I'd really like to kind of go through them as a general overview, and then hopefully what I can do is save some time at the end for discussion after this 30 minutes together. I just admittedly am not going to be able to look at the chat. So if you would like to interrupt, feel free to unmute. I'm a pretty informal person. Otherwise, I will stop sharing my screen and look at the chat after the slides. So as I said, I'm the Executive Director of the American Institute of Dental Public Health, and we are a 501c3 organization focused on the science and education of dental public health. I just put a little bit about our core values here on the slide because they connect to our key areas of interest, one being LGBTQIA oral health, which is why we facilitate the learning collaborative here with Open. It's a place of dedicated programming because in 2019, when we really did essentially a needs assessment or a gap analysis within the oral health community, this was a key area that was identified as a need for more information, for more support, more resources. And so AIDPH focuses on LGBTQ oral health as one of our core areas of programming, and then how that may intersect with some of these other areas of interest. For instance, LGBTQ plus veterans or LGBTQ plus people living in rural areas. And in fact, at the end of this month, as part of our ECHO program, which meets every month, we're focusing on LGBTQ plus rural oral health. And so that should be really exciting. I'll pop the link into the chat near the end of this if you're interested in registering. So I also thought I could give a plug here about the LGBTQIA+ learning collaborative here with Open. We're a group that's been in existence for a couple of years, and I've always facilitated the group. Hopefully somebody else would like to facilitate at some point and take the reins over from me. As a cisgender, straight, white woman, I recognize we're always looking for more inclusion, and I'm happy to facilitate and co-facilitate. But if you are interested, please feel free to reach out to me. But right now, I'm the founder and facilitator of this learning collaborative. And we've been working in a a few different areas. I'm not going to read you everything here on the screen, but essentially what we look at are resources that we can support the oral health community with. That would be research or, one pagers, webinars, which is why we're doing this Take 30 here today. We also engage in a lot of policy and advocacy work. So that might mean calls to action. It may mean developing toolkits, which we have developed one, and I'm happy to review that a little bit later today. And then there's a really big piece here about ensuring that the broader open community understands the impact of LGBTQIA oral health and feels activated and supported enough to engage in equity or equity-centered activities. Some of the things that we've been able to do over the past couple of years, initially when we launched this learning collaborative, we surveyed oral health professionals on what they wanted, what information they were missing, where they felt like they could engage, some of the gaps. And by and large, the resounding result from that survey was that oral health professionals want more information, that there just really isn't enough information on LGBTQ plus oral health. And because this community is always evolving and sort of creating and thriving, that even some of the most basic language kind of trips people up. And so that is one of the reasons why we focus so heavily on providing resources to the oral health community, because that was identified by oral health professionals. I think we got over 200 responses to that survey a couple of years ago. And so that's really been kind of where we focus many of our efforts. We also created 2 toolkits, one on how to engage around the Equality Act for advocacy purposes. And Akil Reynolds, who is another Learning Collaborative participant, I think is going to go into depth around that advocacy strategy and probably some others in a couple of weeks at our next Take 30. It might even be next week at our next Take 30. And so today I'm going to focus on our toolkit on supporting LGBTQIA oral health equity right now and engaging in tips and strategies that are easy for you to implement, hopefully easy to understand, and leaving some time today to discuss. Like I said, I know what tends to trip people up, at least according to our survey and in conversations we've been able to have, is that people really want to engage. People feel activated around the topic, but simply just don't have the resources or maybe even the tools or knowledge to be able to effectively engage. And so hopefully this overview gives you maybe your first step, recognizing this is not going to be comprehensive, but maybe can give you some tangible activities to do now. So in order to bring us to a place of level setting, I like to start with this visual called the genderbread person. And I think it's on its 4th, I think this is 4.0 iteration. And I like this because it gives us a really clear picture of when we talk about the entire LGBTQIA community, LGBTQIA plus community. It really helps to sort of solidify that while these groups of people are often put together in the exact same space in this community, that really it's incredibly diverse. And that when I hear queer people talk about, being in this community together, transgender people, along with perhaps somebody who identifies as gay, that they've been lumped together mostly out of needing to form a community and fight oppression and fight for their own liberation, not necessarily because all of these things are the same and sort of all meshed together. And I really like how this visualization helps people understand the nuance and the differences around what expression is, identity, attraction, sex, etc. So really, really briefly, I wanted to point out a few things here, just so that when we use language later on, you sort of understand why it's important and how it can be helpful. So number one, identity, which is here at the very top on the brain part of the genderbread person, is actually the physiological experience developmentally that happens whenever you affirm your gender. And all people affirm their gender as part of a developmental stage. So whenever I developed this part of my brain and how I identify as cisgender, which means that the body that I was born in matches my biochemical identity in my affirmation process. For other people, that's different, and that does not match the gender or sex assumed at birth. And so we'll talk a little bit about being transgender or gender nonconforming or gender diverse. Attraction is how you feel yourself being drawn to other people. And there's a really large spectrum of attraction. It's not just gay and straight or bi. There are a lot of differences around that attraction and the plus piece of the LGBTQ plus community. And then expression is really the physical manifestation of how you present your gender. And so that could be the clothes that I choose to wear, how I choose to style my hair. It can even be the names that feel best to me. And that is completely different than your anatomical sex, which has to do with the parts of your body. And it's really important to just understand that all of these things have different experiences or manifest in different ways to create experiences for LGBTQ plus people. And I understand you may have questions, but because this is very comprehensive, but I thought it would be a good idea just to level set on those few areas. I'm happy to talk about this more in the question portion if desired. So I'm going to pop this into the chat. Well, I'm not going to pop this into the chat because I can't see it. I can't see the chat, but when I'm done with the slides, I will put this into the chat. But what I wanted to do today is just provide a couple of easy ways to be inclusive. And this is based on a one-pager that the Open Learning Collaborative, LGBTQIA Learning Collaborative put together last year to give everybody some really tangible, easy to access action items to support LGBTQ plus people right now in your organization. A lot of this focuses on pronouns, and that's because pronouns are a really important affirmation process for gender nonconforming and transgender people. Our pronouns are the way that we signal who we want to present to the world, who we are authentically. And so it's a really easy process of just ensuring that your pronouns are visible and that you are creating inclusive spaces for all people to be authentically included and affirmed in your everyday environment. One easy way to do that is putting your pronouns on your Zoom name, just as I have right here. That should be sort of standard practice. And I know that in a lot of spaces, I've heard over and over again, well, I know everybody who's going to be in the meeting. We've known each other forever. And I like to bring this up in that I have been in now several meetings because I always put my pronouns in my Zoom name and I try to remember to introduce myself with my pronouns. But I have had people that I've known for a very long time change their pronouns. And because I set it as a standard practice to put my pronouns in my Zoom name, that they feel as though they're able to do that and authentically signal to me to use their personal pronouns and their authentic pronouns. And so it really does make a lot of sense. It's very easy. It's a very easy practice to set a space of inclusion by putting your pronouns into your Zoom name. But we also invite you to think about other ways that you can use your pronouns, maybe in your email signature, on your websites, and in introductions. And so those are sort of number one place for you to focus is where can you really signal to others that you are accepting, affirming, and that you want to create an inclusive space. And the first thing that you can do that with is using your pronouns. When it comes to patient care, so if you're an oral health clinician or just a clinician in general, make sure that you have spaces on your forms where pronouns are asked. And the best way to ask that is asking for pronouns. It's not asking for gender, it's not asking for sex. It's really asking people what pronouns they want to use. and then ensuring that you're checking that. I know personally, whenever I go to dentist offices at this point, whenever I take my child with me who is transgender, and I tell them my child uses these pronouns, a lot of times they just ignore that on the forms, or maybe they don't understand it. And so I think there's just a place for you to educate yourself too about the use of pronouns. And then if you do ask about pronouns, ensure that you use them. I'm also going to suggest something that may feel silly, but it's actually incredibly important. And that is practice in advance using the correct pronouns for that person. I know this is particularly important for people who use they, them pronouns. Sometimes it feels foreign to use they, them and the singular, but it's incredibly important for you to get people's pronouns right. It makes them feel like they are seen and that their lived experience is honored. And so being able to use and practice the correct pronouns with people in advance can really make a difference in having them just have an inclusive experience with you one-on-one. Using gender neutral language as much as possible is, again, an easy way for you to change kind of your everyday activities. And I like to just encourage people to use the word y'all as much as possible. Being from Texas, it feels like the best gender neutral language to use whenever you're talking to people instead of you guys. And I also just encourage people to use gender neutral language whenever you're talking about community too. So I'm married, I'm cisgender, I'm in a heterosexual relationship, so I have a husband. However, using gender neutral practices like my spouse or my partner can make everybody feel like they're able to describe their community and relationships in an affirming and inclusive way. Lastly, on this slide, advertising that you're affirming and inclusive. Some ways that you can do that are putting up rainbow flags. You can buy these $7 earrings from Amazon if you would like to. They are very bright and advertise inclusive spaces. But there are lots of ways that you can do that. If you're a practitioner and you want to put a rainbow flag in your office, if you want to find your local equality federation and advertise with them that you're an inclusive provider and you're able to see patients and have gone through some sort of training to ensure that you're culturally responsive and aware. There are lots of ways that you can draw patients in and signal and say, I'm a safe and inclusive person for you to work with. There are also a few long-term investments that you can make. So while this is not starting today, it is, again, part of this overview as it relates to not just celebrating people who are LGBTQ during the month of June, but really ensuring that you're making equitable practices now and beyond June. And one way to do that is to do an equity audit for your organization. That means having somebody from the outside, especially if there's a particular area of equity that you would like to look at. In this case, if you really want somebody to do an equity audit around LGBTQIA inclusive practices, you could certainly find organizations who would kind of do an assessment. Where's your leadership at? How are you signaling that you're an inclusive organization? How can you shift some of your policies and practices to make it more an affirming environment? Ensuring that your leadership is inclusive, diverse, and really has an understanding of how to practice equitable LGBTQ practices is also really important. I know sometimes the reason why it sort of prodded me to include this on the slide today was I was talking with somebody last year who had attended one of our webinars around using gender neutral restrooms and how that can be really challenging when most buildings are built with binary restrooms. And so this person was talking about going to their leadership and how they were sort of nervous about saying, hey, we have binary restrooms. It's not really appropriate. We are in this corporate space. How do I kind of talk about this? And using some language there or pointing to a policy that can talk about more affirming or inclusive practices. And while those conversations could potentially be uncomfortable, I hope you understand that having those conversations and investing in inclusive and affirming spaces could save lives, quite literally. having LGBTQ people know that they are welcome in your space can really be a life affirming process for them. So that investment really makes a lot of sense. The last piece that I wanted to share today is about educating yourself and your colleagues, which step one, check, you're here today. Thank you so much for wanting to learn more. But also, it's really important for us to think about the overarching context right now around LGBTQ plus people in general. So before I advance to the next slide, I also just want to actually give a quick warning that the next thing I talk about could potentially be very triggering. And so if you'd like to hop off now, especially if you're an LGBTQ identified person, please feel free to do that. So I'm going to just briefly pause to allow people space if they would like to hop off. Okay. So educating yourself about what's happening within the LGBTQ community means that you have to invest in not looking away during the current political climate. These were some headlines that I pulled today, and they've been bothering me, quite frankly, all day because this is happening during Pride Month. People are calling, conservative extremists, quite frankly, are calling for the execution of queer people, transgender people in particular. And to say that this isn't happening and that it's not leading to queer people feeling like they need to go into hiding, especially during Pride Month, we just can't ignore it. There's simply no way for somebody to have effective oral health or engage effectively in your organization, knowing that they are unsafe, that they are living in fear, danger, trauma, etc. So to ignore that this is happening and that it is not, that it is very specifically looking for danger during Pride Month and that people in the queer community are being targeted during Pride Month would simply be a disservice to the queer community. Just earlier this week, a few days ago, I think it was 21 white nationalists were captured, some of them from my home state in Texas, working their way to a Pride event in order to commit violence against queer people. So I think it would really do a disservice to talk about pronouns, to talk about inclusion and affirmation, and not talk about the very real danger that queer people are currently in. And that is our obligation as oral health professionals who are equity oriented to engage in this conversation, to not look away, and to show up for the queer community, because this is affecting everybody's life. It affects us as allies or advocates. And it is our obligation to do something about it. It is our obligation to educate ourselves, and it's our obligation to stand up for this community. So on that note, I will stop sharing my screen so that I can see everybody. And with the last 8 minutes left, I'd really love to engage in discussion. I'd love to hear more about ways that the Learning Collaborative can support all of you as oral health professionals. Maybe there are resources that you don't have that we could look into developing. Maybe there are particular areas of interest that a webinar or some additional communication would be helpful to provide. So I would also like to say you may join us in our monthly meetings. We'd love to have some new faces. And hopefully this has given you a little bit of insight over some really easy ways that you can start engaging in LGBTQIA+ oral health equity. I'm also going to put some links into the chat right now. So one is to a one-pager that we developed on things that you can do right now to support LGBTQIA oral health equity. The next link I'm going to put into the chat, now that I can see it, is the advocacy toolkit that we put together for the Equality Act. We put this together last year, and unfortunately, the Equality Act still has not passed, so it's still deeply relevant. And then lastly, I'm going to put in the registration information for you to join our monthly meetings around LGBTQIA+ oral health here with Open. And then now I will pause and take questions or just hear back from you all around discussion or any thoughts or ideas.
Annalise, first of all, thank you so much for the presentation. This is great. I was just looking at some additional ways that perhaps, especially as we're talking with oral health providers, especially, what kinds of things can we do as we go into dental offices or work with other dental professionals to make them more aware of the need?
That's a great question, Ife. And on the one pager that I linked to at the very beginning of this chain that I started, there are some bullet points specifically for people working in clinical spaces. And in my opinion, where to start is really with the front office staff and helping them understand differences with mostly forms and collecting health history and personal information. I found that most of the time front office staff don't ask pronouns. And when they ask for gender on the forms, it usually says male, female, other. And that's not necessarily the most inclusive way to ask that question. People aren't others. And so first, like review your forms, ensure you're asking for pronouns, ensure that you're not asking for somebody's husband or wife as their emergency contact. There's just some really easy ways that you can revise your forms to be more inclusive, especially if someone's name is different than their insurance name. And so then there are a few little tips and tricks around just providing clinically competent care to this community, and then an entire guide around creating a more inclusive and affirming workspace that I would certainly recommend.
Thank you.
Hi, Annalise. This is Russ Dunkel. I'm the Wisconsin State Dental Director. Have you reached out and working with this to expand the awareness, like with the ADA and also the Hygiene Association? Have you had any communications with them as well?
We have. The thing that comes to mind is the workshop that we did last year on supporting transgender oral health. And we were able to do that in collaboration with many organizations, including Open, CareQuest, the American Dental Hygiene Association, and there are probably a few more that I've now forgotten. But I would say, yes, we've certainly engaged with those organizations, and we're always looking for more opportunities if you have any identified.
Okay. The other thing is, like you'd mentioned about the front desk staff, that's something that's key for new patients, that they really need to communicate or try to read better from the office because they're the gatekeepers. So many times that's who you need to get kind of a thought process or a feeling of how the practices may be. So that's another thing to consider going forward with that.
I love that. Yeah, thank you for lifting that up.
You bet.
Hi, Annalise. It's Tanya Dorfman from Oral Health Kansas. I don't have a question. I just kind of want to say, want to say thank you for this. And I want to say I appreciate you talking about things like leaning into gender neutral language and affirming your support as allies. Sometimes I can get a little bit cynical and think of things like when you see organizations or companies change their logo in June to the pride flag, I think, oh, I hope you actually live that. But we actually in my organization had a DEI training this morning, and we talked about performative versus performative activities like that versus actually living it. And one thing I just kind of relearned was, you can only trust what you see. And so it's okay to trust that if somebody uses a pride flag in their logo or whatever for this month, then trust it until you see something different. So I appreciated you kind of reinforcing that. I think that's really important. And you and I've had that conversation about y'all, and I'm not a y'all, but we'll try to work on really minimizing the you guys that I use all the time. So thank you. The gender neutral language is very helpful. I just appreciate this. Thank you.
Thanks, Tanya. And I think you're completely right. And And that really kind of applies to everybody, and that we can't be performative with equity at all. If we want to commit to racial equity, we have to commit to being anti-racist. These are just simply ways that we have to change our entire life. And I really appreciate you identifying that this is a long-term commitment we all make. Mehek, I know that you mentioned in the chat, what are additional websites or resources to help organizations consider to be an ally? Thank you for raising that question. My biggest, I guess, response to that whenever I get asked this question is look at the Equality Federation or the Equality State entity in your state and connect with them. So here in Texas, we have Equality Texas. We also have the Transgender Education Network of Texas. And there's some counterpart to those. There's Equality Florida, Equality Arkansas. There's usually some sort of equality entity in all 50 states, and there are probably more that you can get connected to that stay plugged into state legislatures that will let you know about ways that you can testify or at least understand how bills are advancing. And then really easy ways to be an ally, like right now during the month of June, showing up to their events, having booths and saying, hey, come visit me in my office. We're inclusive to everybody. Those are the ways that I would probably suggest, is going straight to those people who are working in that space all the time in your state and asking them how you can be supportive.
Another source, Annalise, and then I've got to jump off for another meeting. NASEM, believe it or not, which is the National Association of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, almost monthly has a webinar regarding this topic. So that might be another source. And sometimes FIRSA has information as well.
That's great. Thank you for adding that.
You bet. Take care, everyone.
Well, thank you guys so much for being here. Again, a plug for the LGBTQ+ Learning Collaborative if you're interested in joining us each month. And I appreciate everybody, again, asking for the questions and having such an engaging discussion.
Thanks, Annalise.